Alright, so today's video is going to be about the differential reinforcement schedules that they have, and just differential reinforcement in general. I use it all the time, and differential reinforcement is amazing when it comes to shaping, teaching appropriate behavior, increasing a desired behavior, decreasing a desired behavior. It's great. It's something that we always use, and even when we don't even realize it. We can use it pretty much effortlessly, even just in everyday life. So there's 5 different types of reinforcement schedules in terms of differential reinforcement. There's differential reinforcement of incompatible behavior, differential reinforcement of alternative behavior, differential reinforcement of high rates of behavior, differential reinforcement of low rates of behavior, and differential reinforcement of diminishing rates of behavior. And it sounds like a lot, but they all follow the same principle and they all follow the same way of implementation. It's just what they're rewarding is different. And the way that differential reinforcement schedules work is you take baseline on the behavior. With everything, you take an initial baseline so you can show change in the behavior that's correlated to the treatment, and you can kind of give yourself a base point as to where to start. So let's say, for example, you find that this kid hits his head 5 times in 30 seconds. Or, sorry, this kid hits his head 2 times in 30 seconds. You're going to want to start your interval at less than 15, because then it'd be like 1 head hit within every 15 seconds. So maybe you start at 10 seconds. So you have a 10-second interval. And in that 10-second interval, if he engages in the incompatible, the alternative, the high rate, low rate, or whatever it is, whatever schedule you choose, if he engages in that instead of the target behavior, then he is able to access rewards. However, if he engages in that behavior instead, you restart the interval, and then he tries again. That might sound confusing. I'm going to come back to that. I'm going to explain the schedules first, and then we'll come back to that. So differential reinforcement of incompatible behavior looks to find a behavior to replace the target behavior that's incompatible. So for example, head hitting, you need your hand to hit your head. That's how his topography is, let's say. You're going to want to find an incompatible behavior that makes his hand keeps his hand busy so he can't hit his head. So that could be something like manipulating a game, manipulating a toy. So or keeping his hand in his pocket. So for the DRI, it would be, okay, well, let's do 15-second intervals. And if his hand does not engage in hitting head, but instead engages in putting his hand in his pocket, keeping his hands busy with like any work activity or game, then he's able to access reward that every 10 seconds. Does that make sense? So he's playing game, and then if he does not hit his head within that 10 seconds of playing the game, and playing the game's incompatible behavior, within that 10 seconds he doesn't engage in head hitting, he's able to get the reward at the end of that 10 seconds. If he's playing the game, hits his head within that interval, the interval restarts. You stop your timer, you reset it to 10 seconds, and he tries again. And you don't address the behavior at all. Well, it depends on your behavior plan, but typically you don't adjust the behavior again. So for alternative behavior, we're going to use a different example. We're going to use like calling out in class. So you're putting that on a DRA, and the alternative behavior, you can either choose in a range of behaviors that you'll accept, or you can just choose one. But basically, you choose that one behavior, and if the student engages in that one behavior instead of calling out during that 10-second interval, then you deliver the reward at the 10-second interval. So, for example, he calls out, and then you want your alternative behavior to be hand raising. If he does not call out during 10 seconds, and he raises his hand instead during that time, he can get the reward. Or if he just doesn't call out in general, and there's no questions asked or anything like that, but he doesn't call out, you can still reward that behavior. And essentially, the 10 seconds is still carrying on from the other scenario, but obviously you can change it to like 30 minutes, 15 minutes, whatever seems fit for the scenario. For differential reinforcement of other behavior, you're reinforcing any behavior other than the target behavior. So if we go back to the head hitting example, if 10 seconds he does not engage in any head hitting at all, but he's like doing something else weird, like picking his nose, you know, playing with his hair, doing something nice like that, fine, perfect. He gets the reward at the end of that 10-second interval. Differential reinforcement of high rates of behavior is for behaviors that you want to see be increasing. And you basically set a goal for this certain amount of time. So if you want him to raise his hand more and to speak more in class, let's say you could have a high rate interval of like 1 hand raise per 5-minute interval. And then as he's more successful in coming into contact with reinforcement, you can increase it to 2 hand raises in 5 minutes. And then 3, or so on and so forth. And then you're just differentially shaping and reinforcing that. For differential rates of low rates of behavior, you are starting off with a number that he needs to just not engage in the behavior, like a cap. That's a cap. Diminishing rates of behavior, he cannot exceed. So it's either less than 1 or less than 2 rates of behavior. It's common with stereotypy for those with high rates of stereotypy who cannot, like, where it's most likely not possible that they're gonna get teach stereotypy out of the system or out of the repertoire. Diminishing rates is good because then it allows them to at least have 1 episode of stereotypy or 2 or 3 and still be allowed to come into contact with reinforcement. So it's like, okay, within 5 minutes, he must have less than 6 episodes of stereotypy in order to achieve reinforcement. And then you can just decrease that number systematically until you're able to get it to less than 1 or 1 or less than, which is pretty good still, you know. And I think it's like really important that like people understand that sometimes behaviors cannot be completely taught out of someone's repertoire, and to be realistic about it. And it's also important to know when to use the DRD or DRL, because, you know, the point of this is to make sure that the student comes in contact with reinforcement so that they learn that the appropriate behavior is going to be rewarded and not the inappropriate behavior. And if you have a student or a learner that may not be able to come in contact with them, you know, giving them at least 1 or giving them at least 2 tries to engage in it will lead to more successful intervention than to ask them to engage in an alternative or an incompatible. And also when writing your behavior intervention plans or implementing your behavior intervention plans, you have to remember that sometimes behaviors change topography. So that means that behaviors sometimes change how they look. So your student might be hitting his head with his hand, and then you you do the hand squishing or you do puzzle playing or something like that, but then he starts kicking himself. So that's just like the same function, whatever the function was, but it's just changed. So now it's kicking instead of head hitting. And so it's important to consider that too when choosing which reinforcement schedule to use for your learner. Reinforcement schedules are like hard because they seem very similar in many aspects, and they are also very different, you know, and it's really dependent on your learner and what they need and what's like a very reasonable goal for them to be able to decide which one's the best option. So, oh yeah, and then there's also the variable interval schedules, but I'm going to talk about that later because this is already a pretty long video. But I hope this helps, and I hope that it was clear how to implement the differential reinforcement schedules. You know, like set your predetermined time, and then if they don't engage in the problem behavior or engage in lower rates of the problem behavior, depending on which schedule you choose, you reward at the very end of the cycle. If they engage in the behavior or engage in more than the allotted amount during this interval, you start it again. So even if it's like, this is the interval, they engage here, you start it again. So now they have this much time. And when you find that they've been successful for like multiple days and the data is being stable, then you can increase the duration of the interval. You can increase the rate of the behavior you want to see or decrease the rate of behavior you want to see. You know, that's up to you and your clinical judgment. But it's important to make sure you're doing it systematically. So if you're increasing time, for example, you're not doing, oh, we're going to increase it by 5 seconds here, then we're going to increase it by a minute, then we're going to increase it by 45 seconds. Like, make sure it's the same. Or like you're using the same like equation. So, because I know sometimes like they do it exponentially, exponential growth, or sometimes they can just do it by +5, +5, +5. Totally up to you. But once you pick a way of how to systematically increase it, you need to stay with it. And it's also important to not speak during the differential reinforcement, because the idea of it is that, you know, you want this skill to generalize. You want this low rate, high rate, incompatible behavior, alternative behavior to continue throughout their daily life without you having to be there, without the materials having to be there. Like, you want this to be a lifelong thing. And if you have verbal feedback, verbal prompts, verbal rewards, then it just embeds you into the schedule and embeds you into the intervention, and that's not something that you want. You want this to be something that they can not necessarily predict, you know. They don't know when it's gonna happen. They don't know when it's running. Like, so they should always be on their best behavior. They should always be engaging in appropriate responses. And that's a great way for it to generalize. So, you know, you don't need to explicitly say, hey, we're gonna run our DRO now. It just happens, and they'll eventually catch on, and then that's how behavior changes and behavior increases or decreases. So I hope this helped. I hope this wasn't too crazy for you, and I hope this wasn't too like long. But I really enjoy making these videos, and I enjoy talking to you guys as if, you know, we're just having a cup of tea. Today's coffee for me. If you have any suggestions, please let me know. And I'm still learning a lot about this field too, so I hope that you guys can learn with me. All right, bye.